right behind me in Colombo, that is Gota Go Gama or Gota Go Home. Gotabaya Go Home. That is how this protest started. Many are calling this the Tahrir Square of Sri Lanka. But now that Ranil Wickremesinghe is the elected president of Sri Lanka, what is it that the protesters intend to do? With me, a group of young activists and protesters who've been on the streets for the past 103 days, if I'm not wrong, 103 days and counting. Let me begin this conversation. Joining me is Rai Balthazar. Rai is an activist. Also with us is Kalpana, Madhubhashini and Anjana. Now, some young activists that India Today will speak to, but Rai, let me begin by asking you. Ranil Wickremesinghe, acceptable to the street?
Not acceptable, because he is only an extension, Gaurav, of the Rajapaksa regime. He came in very particularly, he was brought in by Gotabaya Rajapaksa to safeguard Gotabaya's place in power, and now that he has left, Ranil has acquired that place. We don't see him to be any different to the Rajapakshas. He's only an extension, and therefore we don't think that the majority of people cannot validate the fact that he is our president.
Okay. Now, majority of the people who are protesting here may not validate him, Anjana, but I want to understand from you, after all, 134 of all valid votes were in his favor. 219 votes were valid of 225, 134, which means more than 60% are in his favor.
Most definitely, and that was in the parliament itself. But what we are meaning is, what we are saying is, he has no mandate in the streets, in the country itself, in the villages, in the towns, in the streets. There's most definitely no people mandate for our current president. Definitely no mandate.
So no people's mandate. After all, he didn't win his own seat. He's here. Is he beholden to the ruling SLPP? And be that as it may, what is top priority at this time, Kalpana, Madhubhashini, when your country is actually in deep economic crisis, deep political crisis? Many argue he perhaps is the best man for the job.
He has been appointed before also, and our country became to this stage. And not only him, there has been several politicians for the past 74 years, mainly two parties. One is led by him, the other one was led by Mahinda Rajapakshas, and they are mostly Sri Lanka Freedom Party and now Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna. So these two parties, having been appointed in Sri Lanka for the past 74 years, election by election, they had not done anything to this country. I mean, that's why we are in this deep economic crisis. Anything, but by anything I mean anything which will affect our economic core. That means which will enhance our exports and whatever it is.
Does he have a roadmap? Would you be waiting to find out whether he has a roadmap to revive the economy or not? Now, I spoke to several of these activists, all of them gainfully employed otherwise in life, and many others we spoke to at this square here. But 103 days and counting. Will these protests intensify in the days, weeks and months ahead? We bring you this ground report from Gota Go Home Center.
Shock, disbelief, anger. Hundreds assembled at the Gota Gama Centre, the protest site in Colombo, as news of Ranil Wickremesinghe being elected President of Sri Lanka filtered in. Protesters, both college students, activists and young working professionals, said they felt let down and cheated.
Well, our aim to start off with, as you quite rightly said, was a slogan, a consensus for Gotabaya to go home. But realistically, with Ranil coming in, what we have to understand is Ranil is no different to the Rajapaksa regime. Yes, Gota was the figurehead of it, and we were asking for him to go home. But realistically, how different is Ranil to that? He is also serving the same interests of the Rajapakshas.
Protesters insist they're in for the long haul and will not be intimidated by President Ranil Wickremesinghe being elected as president, which according to them is an extension of the Gotabaya Rajapaksa regime continuing.
We have sent a very clear message to parliamentarians that we do not want Ranil Wickremesinghe as our next president. So the fact that he has won with a decisive majority shows us how unaccountable and how unresponsive the parliamentarians are to the demands of the people. So we will continue the struggle.
Activists say they're feeling left down that 134 MPs supported Ranil Wickremesinghe, ignoring the voices of protests in the streets. The next phase of their agitation is not just going to be against Ranil Wickremesinghe, but also against the MPs who they claimed ignored the voices of the masses.
We should continue the protest forward because Ranil should go home because he was not a democratically elected parliamentarian. Even he became PM because he supported Rajapaksa regime, and now buying the parliamentarians he has become the president. So the people's struggle will continue until he resigns.
There are apprehensions that the regime may crack down on protesters in the name of tackling anarchy and to restore order to bring in both tourists and investors. But protesters insist they will regroup and form a strategy to continue their struggle for what they insist is their goal of power to the people and grassroots democracy with equal distribution of wealth.
These protesters at least see Ranil Wickremesinghe as an extension of the same regime, and they want a clean change. Some of the protesters we spoke to said they're extremely disappointed. At least 134 members of parliament supported Ranil Wickremesinghe. Clearly an indication that the aspirations of these protesters and those in parliament are very different. An indication that Sri Lanka is likely to see days and weeks of turmoil ahead. With cameraman Kripal Singh in Colombo, Sri Lanka, Gaurav Sawant for India Today.